Your kitchen setup violates federal code. I walked into my kitchen to find a complete stranger photographing the inside of my refrigerator like she was documenting evidence. My blood ran cold. This woman had somehow entered my house without permission and was treating my personal space like her own property. HOA compliance inspection, she announced, not even bothering to look up from her clipboard. The sheer violation left me speechless. Who just walks into someone's home and starts photographing their private belongings? Comment below if you've ever had an HOA invade your privacy like this. Excuse me, what are you doing? I managed to keep my voice steady despite my hands starting to shake. Not from fear, from pure rage. In 12 years prosecuting criminals, I'd never had someone commit crimes directly in front of me in my own home. Margaret finally looked up, clipboard in hand, wearing a cheap polyester blazer that screamed, "Fake authority." She had that particular Karen haircut, you know the one, and the dead-eyed stare of someone who'd discovered that intimidating people gave her a rush better than any drug. Her presence in my kitchen felt like a violation that went beyond simple trespass. HOA compliance inspection, she repeated like I was slow. Emergency powers under subsection 15-3. She gestured at my open refrigerator with her pen like she was conducting an orchestra. Your refrigerator placement violates community standards. Kitchen appliances must be compliant with federal housing guidelines. Every word out of her mouth was legally meaningless gibberish, but she delivered it with the confidence of someone reading from the Constitution. I watched her photograph my coffee maker, my toaster, even the inside of my microwave. This wasn't random crazy neighbor behavior. This was systematic, professional, and completely illegal. Margaret moved through my kitchen like a contractor on a bid walk, slapping bright adhesive tags onto shelves and appliances, scanning barcodes she'd printed herself, and sweeping a laser measurer across the counters as if mapping a hazardous zone. She narrated each step into her phone, timestamps, fake code sites, invented violations, building a dossier in real time. The performance was chilling, not because it was careful, but because it was scripted, a traveling show of counterfeit authority she'd rehearsed 100 times. I need to see some identification and paperwork, I said, stepping closer. Big mistake. Margaret's eyes lit up like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. She pulled out her phone and started filming me. Aggressive homeowner behavior, she announced to her camera. Possible mental health concerns. Refusing to comply with legal inspection. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, a federal prosecutor who'd sent organized crime bosses to prison, being filmed by a suburban housewife, claiming I was the criminal. But she'd just made her first major mistake. By filming me, she was creating evidence of her own crimes. This inspection is being documented for county compliance records. Margaret continued now, openly rifling through my mail on the counter. Bill's work correspondence, personal letters. She photographed everything with the thoroughness of someone building a criminal profile. Federal employees are subject to enhanced community oversight. That last line made my blood freeze. Somehow she knew about my job. In a neighborhood where I'd told everyone I was a freelance consultant, this woman had done research. This wasn't her first rodeo. She'd targeted me specifically because she thought a federal employee would be too scared to fight back. I pulled out my own phone and started recording. Margaret's face shifted from smug confidence to something uglier, more predatory. Recording a compliance officer is obstruction, she snarled. That's a federal crime. We stood there in my kitchen, both filming each other, circling like predators, sizing up potential threats. The air crackled with tension that had nothing to do with kitchen appliances or housing codes. This was about power control and who would blink first. Margaret had clearly won this psychological warfare many times before, but she'd never faced a federal prosecutor. She knocked over my coffee mug, deliberately. The crash echoed through the house like a gunshot, ceramic shards scattering across my floor in a pattern that looked almost artistic. Accidents happen during inspections, she said with a smile that could freeze hell. You'll be billed for non-compliance cleanup fees. The calculated cruelty was breathtaking. She wasn't just stealing money or violating my privacy. She was psychologically torturing me, demonstrating her power to destroy my possessions, while claiming legal authority to do so. Margaret continued her systematic violation of my home, photographing family photos, examining books on my shelves, even opening my pantry to document what she called food storage violations. Every action was designed to make me feel helpless, invaded, and completely at her mercy. She created fictional violations for normal household items, claiming my coffee maker was improperly positioned and my toaster represented fire hazard non-compliance. The performance was so elaborate, so convincing, that I almost began questioning whether these regulations might actually exist. When she finally left, Margaret made sure to sweep all my papers off the kitchen table in one dramatic gesture. Documents scattered everywhere, work files mixed with personal mail, everything I'd spent years keeping private now violated and exposed like crime scene evidence. She handed me an official-looking violation notice, printed on letterhead, that looked governmental but wasn't. $500 for unauthorized kitchen modifications, $200 for inspection interference, $300 for documentation obstruction, and at the bottom, in small print that made my skin crawl, continued non-compliance will result in escalated enforcement measures, including property seizure recommendations. As her footsteps echoed down my driveway, I realized this was just the beginning. Margaret hadn't come here for money or compliance. She'd come here to establish dominance, to demonstrate that she could enter my home whenever she wanted, and there was nothing I could do about it. The violation notice was just a pretext. The real message was clear: resistance was futile, and tomorrow would bring escalated consequences that would make today's invasion look gentle. I woke up the next morning to the sound of hissing air that made my stomach drop before I was fully conscious. My car sat in the driveway with all 4 tires slashed in perfect X patterns, and someone had spray-painted "violation" across my windshield in red letters that looked like blood under the morning sun. A note was tucked under my wiper, written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. Continued non-compliance will result in escalated enforcement, HOA management. The vandalism was precise professional design to maximize psychological impact while appearing random to anyone who didn't know the context. Mrs. Carter from next door appeared at my fence line looking around nervously, like a resistance fighter checking for enemy surveillance before approaching. "She did the same thing to my roses last week," she whispered, gesturing toward her garden, where perfectly healthy bushes had been cut down to stumps. "Cut them all down at night and said they violated height restrictions. When I asked to see the rules, she threatened to call immigration about my grandson." Mrs. Carter had lived here for 30 years, was a retired teacher, and her grandson was born in Seattle. But Margaret had found her pressure point and pressed hard. "She's done this to 12 families in the past 6 months." Mrs. Carter continued, her voice barely audible. "Nobody reports it because her brother works for the county and makes complaints disappear." That piece of information hit me like a physical blow to the chest. County connections explained how Margaret operated with such brazen confidence. She wasn't just some unhinged neighbor operating alone. She was protected by institutional corruption that made her virtually untouchable through normal channels. The realization made my destroyed car look like a warning shot rather than random vandalism. As I stood there looking at my destroyed property, more neighbors began approaching like survivors of some natural disaster, finding each other in the aftermath. Tom from across the street. "She claimed my fence was illegal and threw something toxic over it that made my dog sick for 3 days. Vet bills cost me $800. Jessica, the single mom from the corner house. She said my kids were too loud during normal play hours and threatened to call child services if I didn't pay soundproofing fees." Each story followed the same pattern: identify a vulnerability, create a fake violation demand, payment escalate if refused. The stories kept coming, each more disturbing than the last. The Johnsons paid $2,000 for driveway positioning violations after Margaret threatened to have their car towed daily. The elderly Pattersons handed over their Social Security money when Margaret claimed their bird feeder attracted non-compliant wildlife that could trigger federal environmental penalties. Margaret had systematically terrorized every family on our street, extracting money through elaborate threats backed by her brother's county position. By 10 a.m., Margaret was back with reinforcements that looked like a paramilitary operation. 2 large men in yellow vests labeled HOA enforcement flanked her as she marched up my driveway with the confidence of someone leading an invading army. They carried measuring tapes, cameras, clipboards, and equipment that created an impressive show of official authority designed to intimidate anyone watching. Neighbors gathered at their windows as this fake government operation set up shop on my property like they were conducting a federal investigation. Margaret directed her fake enforcement team like a general commanding troops in occupied territory. "Measure the property line variance," she barked with theatrical authority. "Document all visible code violations. Photograph evidence of non-compliance." The men moved with practiced efficiency, clearly having performed this routine many times before. They measured distances that didn't matter, noted violations that didn't exist, and created an impressive file of completely meaningless documentation that looked official to anyone not familiar with actual government procedures. "Nice federal job you have there," Margaret said, approaching me with that same predatory smile that made my skin crawl. "Would be a shame if compliance issues affected your security clearance." The threat was crystal clear and terrifyingly specific. She knew exactly who I was and exactly how to destroy me. One call to my supervisors about neighborhood disturbances or unstable behavior, and my career would be over. Federal prosecutors are held to impossible standards. We can't even get parking tickets without explaining ourselves to ethics committees. I watched these fake enforcement officers photograph my house, my yard, even my mailbox with the systematic thoroughness of actual investigators building a criminal case. They measured distances between my house and property line, documented the height of my fence, and created diagrams that looked like architectural surveys. Margaret supervised every action, making notes on her clipboard and directing them to specific areas she wanted documented. The performance was so convincing that I began to doubt my own certainty that this was fraud. "You have 48 hours to correct all identified violations," Margaret announced, handing me another official-looking document that resembled actual government paperwork. "Failure to comply will result in county intervention and possible property action." The paper looked governmental, but cited non-existent codes and impossible requirements. Kitchen appliance relocations, $800. Mailbox height adjustments, $400. Property line vegetation compliance, $1,200. Each item came with specific fees that would total nearly $3,000. As Margaret's fake enforcement team packed up their equipment with military precision, I noticed something that made my prosecutor instincts scream warnings. They were taking photographs of other houses too, not just mine. This wasn't personal harassment targeting me specifically. This was a neighborhood-wide operation that had been running systematically for months. Margaret had been conducting these fake inspections throughout the community, targeting anyone who looked vulnerable, anyone who might pay rather than fight. And tomorrow she was planning to bring what she called county authority backup for an official inspection that would escalate far beyond today's theater. The scope of Margaret's operation was becoming clear as neighbors shared their experiences throughout the day. She'd been systematically working through every house on multiple streets, creating fake violations and demanding payments that ranged from hundreds to thousands of dollars. Families who paid were left alone for a few months before being targeted again with new violations. Families who refused faced escalated harassment that included property damage, false reports to various agencies, and threats that became increasingly creative and personal. I had less than 24 hours to figure out how to stop Margaret's operation without ending my own career in the process. Her county connections meant that normal complaint channels would be useless. Her brother would simply make any reports disappear. But Margaret had made a critical error by targeting a federal prosecutor. She thought my federal employment made me vulnerable to her threats. She didn't realize it made me uniquely equipped to recognize and prosecute exactly the type of organized fraud scheme she was operating. The neighborhood meeting was supposed to be about upcoming holiday decorations and winter maintenance schedules. Instead, I walked into Margaret's perfectly orchestrated ambush that had transformed the community center into something resembling a courtroom, with herself as judge, jury, and executioner. She'd arrived early to set up a PowerPoint presentation that was already running on the wall: compliance issues, the David Mitchell case study. My house, my yard, even photos from inside my kitchen were displayed for everyone to see like evidence in a criminal trial. 30 neighbors sat in folding chairs, arranged in rows, looking confused and terrified, as Margaret clicked through slides documenting my supposed crimes against community standards. The presentation was professionally designed, with charts, graphs, and official-looking documentation that would have impressed anyone not familiar with actual government procedures. Margaret had invested serious time and effort into creating a multimedia experience designed to publicly humiliate me while establishing her authority over the entire neighborhood. "Federal housing regulations require immediate action," Margaret announced, laser pointer dancing across images of my refrigerator like she was delivering a lecture at a government training seminar. "Mr. Mitchell's violations have triggered mandatory oversight that affects our entire neighborhood." She'd turned my privacy invasion into a public spectacle, making me the villain who'd brought unwanted government attention to what had been a peaceful suburban community. The slides showed evidence of kitchen non-compliance, mailbox infractions, and property line violations that would make any reasonable person laugh. if they weren't terrified of becoming Margaret's next target. Margaret's presentation included detailed financial projections, showing how my non-compliance could affect everyone's property values. Fake statistics about federal enforcement actions, fabricated data about neighborhood compliance ratings, and completely fictional charts showing declining home prices in areas with resistance patterns. She'd created an entire alternate reality where my refusal to pay her extortion fees was somehow threatening everyone's financial security and bringing federal scrutiny to the entire community. I stood up, heart pounding, with the kind of performance anxiety I hadn't felt since my first courtroom appearance 15 years ago. "Margaret, I'd like to see the legal authority for these inspections." My voice was steadier than I felt, but I could hear the slight tremor that always appeared when I was controlling rage. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some sympathetic, others clearly viewing me as the troublemaker who'd brought this crisis down on everyone. Margaret's smile widened, like a shark scenting blood in the water. "Are you questioning federal housing compliance law?" she asked, voice dripping with fake concern and barely contained triumph. "Because that's exactly the kind of attitude that triggers enhanced enforcement actions." She gestured toward her presentation slides showing photographs of houses in other neighborhoods with red seized stamps across them. The images were clearly fake, but they looked convincing enough to terrify people who had never seen actual government enforcement procedures. "I'm questioning your authority to enforce anything," I replied, prosecutor training finally overriding my anxiety and personal concerns about career protection. "Show me the HOA charter that gives you inspection powers. Show me your certification. Show me the specific statutes you're citing." The room went silent, except for the hum of the overhead projector. Margaret's laser pointer stopped moving. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face, like a crack appearing in a dam. "The authority comes from federal partnership programs," she said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction and taken on a defensive tone that told me I'd struck a nerve. "Local compliance officers are authorized under Housing and Community Development Regulations Section 42 Alpha." More gibberish, but delivered with less confidence and more obvious improvisation. She was making up numbers and references in real time, hoping nobody would challenge her on specifics. "Which specific federal statute authorizes local HOA inspections?" I pressed, using the same tone I used to dismantle lying witnesses in federal court. "What's your certification number? Which federal agency issued your credentials? Which department oversees your compliance authority?" Each question hit like a precision strike, aimed at the weakest points of her fabricated authority. I'd spent 12 years learning how to dismantle fraudulent claims, and Margaret's entire operation was built on legal quicksand that wouldn't survive even basic scrutiny. Margaret's recovery was impressive in its audacity, I had to admit. "Mr. Mitchell seems very familiar with federal procedure," she said, turning to address the neighbors with renewed confidence. "Makes you wonder why someone would know so much about challenging legitimate authority. Makes you wonder what he might be hiding." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. She was implying I was some kind of criminal with experience evading law enforcement, turning my competence against me. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and I saw doubt creeping into faces that had been sympathetic moments before. Margaret had just weaponized my legal knowledge, making it seem suspicious rather than helpful. She was painting me as someone who knew too much about avoiding government oversight, someone whose resistance to her authority suggested familiarity with criminal procedure. The psychological manipulation was masterful and terrifying. "Tomorrow we settle this permanently," Margaret announced, shutting down her presentation with theatrical efficiency. "Federal enforcement team arrives at 9 a.m. for comprehensive compliance action. Anyone with concerns about Mr. Mitchell's pattern of resistance can express them directly to federal authorities." She gathered her materials while neighbors filed out, shooting nervous glances in my direction like I might be dangerous. I'd won the legal argument but lost the room. Margaret had successfully painted me as both the problem and someone suspiciously knowledgeable about challenging government authority. Neighbors who'd been sympathetic now viewed me with suspicion and fear. They thought my resistance was bringing federal heat down on everyone, when in reality Margaret's fraud was the only federal crime being committed. But explaining that would require revealing my identity, which would end my career. As I walked home alone through streets where I'd hoped to find peace and anonymity, Margaret's words echoed in my head. "Federal enforcement team arrives at 9 a.m. I knew no legitimate federal agency was coming, but Margaret clearly had resources connections and a sophisticated operation that had been running successfully for years. She was planning something big for tomorrow, something designed to permanently destroy my credibility and probably extract thousands of dollars from terrified neighbors who now viewed me as the cause of their problems rather than a potential solution. At exactly 9 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled up to my house with the kind of theatrical precision that Margaret probably thought looked impressive, but actually screamed amateur hour to anyone familiar with actual federal operations. Men in dark suits climbed out complete with earpieces, badges clipped to their belts, and the kind of stern expressions that screamed federal authority to anyone who'd watched too many crime shows. Margaret emerged from the lead vehicle like a general inspecting troops, clipboard in hand, directing her fake federal agents with barely contained glee and obvious satisfaction. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Agent Thompson with the Federal Housing Compliance Division," the lead actor announced, flashing a badge that looked official from a distance but would never survive close inspection. "We're here to conduct a mandatory compliance inspection of your property under Federal Housing Statutes Section 94 Delta." His delivery was actually pretty good. Serious, professional, just bureaucratic enough to sound real. Margaret stood behind him, radiating triumph, clearly believing her own performance had reached Oscar-worthy levels. Margaret had hired actual actors, rented legitimate-looking vehicles, and created fake federal credentials that probably cost thousands of dollars. The investment in this fraud was staggering, suggesting she'd been planning this operation for weeks or months. But it was also her biggest mistake. The more elaborate and expensive her fraud became, the more serious the federal charges would be when I finally brought her down. She was building her own prison sentence, one fake badge at a time. I invited them in, secretly starting my phone's recording app as they crossed my threshold with the measured steps of people performing for an audience. "What specific federal agency do you represent?" I asked Agent Thompson while his partner began photographing my living room. "Federal Housing Compliance Division, Northern Regional Office," he replied without hesitation. Margaret had coached him well, but not well enough. "Which department is that under HUD Justice Treasury?" I continued. "We're an interagency task force," Thompson said, but I caught the micro-hesitation that told me he was improvising outside his script. Margaret's preparation hadn't included detailed questions about federal bureaucracy. "Interagency coordination between multiple departments for comprehensive housing compliance enforcement," he continued, adding more words to cover his uncertainty. The performance was convincing for civilians, but I'd worked with actual federal agents for over a decade. The inspection was a masterclass in professional-looking fraud that probably would have fooled most homeowners completely. They photographed everything with expensive cameras, measured distances that didn't matter, with legitimate surveying equipment, and filled out forms that looked governmental but cited completely fictitious regulations. Margaret directed the operation like a conductor pointing out violations with increasing confidence as her performance gained momentum and her actors hit their marks. "Kitchen appliance positioning non-compliance under Federal Statute 47 Gamma," Agent Thompson announced, consulting his fake documentation. "Mailbox height variance exceeding Federal Postal Service coordination requirements. Property line vegetation infractions violating federal environmental compliance standards." Each violation came with specific fines ranging from $300 to $1,200, creating a total assessment that would devastate most families' budgets while remaining just below the threshold that might trigger actual investigations. Margaret's eyes were practically glowing with satisfaction as she watched her fake federal agents systematically document violations throughout my house. She'd created the perfect extortion scheme, fake federal authority, that terrified people into paying outrageous fines for imaginary violations. And it had clearly worked on dozens of other victims throughout multiple neighborhoods. The operation was sophisticated, profitable, and completely criminal. But Margaret had gotten overconfident, drunk on her own performance and the apparent success of her elaborate fraud. She began explaining the entire operation to her fake agents, describing how they'd handled non-compliant residents in other neighborhoods with the casual cruelty of someone discussing pest control. The Smith family paid immediately once we mentioned immigration concerns. The Chens submitted after we discussed their son's college applications potentially being affected. Mr. Peterson handed over $4,000 when we suggested his divorce settlement might be reviewed for federal housing violations. She was confessing to systematic extortion, while I recorded every word, building a federal case against herself with each sentence. Margaret described targeting vulnerable families, exploiting their fears, and collecting money through threats that would carry decades in federal prison if they were real. But they weren't real. They were elaborate theater designed to terrorize suburban families into paying protection money to a neighborhood sociopath who'd discovered that fake federal authority was more profitable than actual employment. "What happens if someone refuses to pay?" I asked innocently, giving Margaret more rope to hang herself with. Agent Thompson looked to Margaret for guidance, since this question wasn't in his script. "Continued resistance triggers escalated federal action." Margaret replied, clearly relishing the moment and her absolute power over terrified homeowners. "Property seizure, criminal charges for obstruction of federal housing compliance, investigation of all financial records for additional violations." She was describing crimes that would carry decades in federal prison if they were real, delivered with the sadistic pleasure of someone who enjoyed wielding power over helpless victims. Margaret had found the perfect scam: terrorize suburban families with fake federal authority, collect money for imaginary violations, and rely on people's natural fear of government to prevent them from investigating her claims. It was brilliant, profitable, and about to destroy her life completely. The final stroke was Margaret's demand for immediate payment, accompanied by threats that revealed the full scope of her criminal operation. Federal compliance fines must be paid within 24 hours to avoid escalated action. Agent Thompson announced, handing me a bill for $7,800. "Cash or certified check only. Personal checks are not acceptable for federal violations." Margaret couldn't resist adding her own threat. "Mr. Mitchell, your federal employment makes non-compliance particularly serious. Your security clearance, your career, everything depends on resolving this immediately." She thought she was delivering the killing blow that would force me to pay thousands of dollars to protect my career. Instead, she'd just signed her own arrest warrant. By explicitly targeting me because of my federal employment, she'd committed a federal crime that carried enhanced penalties. By demanding immediate payment under threat of property seizure, she'd committed extortion. By impersonating federal agents, she'd violated laws that carried up to 3 years per incident. Margaret had just committed enough federal crimes in one morning to spend the rest of her life in prison. Margaret called an emergency neighborhood meeting for that evening, promising to resolve the federal compliance crisis affecting our entire community, with the dramatic flair of someone announcing the solution to a natural disaster. She had spent the afternoon going door to door, spreading panic about impending federal seizures and criminal investigations, like some kind of suburban Paul Revere warning about government invasion. By 7 p.m., every resident was packed into the community center, faces tight with fear and anger that you could feel crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Margaret had successfully convinced them that my resistance was bringing federal heat down on everyone, transforming me from victim to villain in the span of a few hours. The mood was ugly desperate, and exactly what Margaret needed to extract payments from multiple families simultaneously. She'd turned individual extortion into community-wide panic, scaling up her operation to potentially collect tens of thousands of dollars in a single evening from families too terrified to think clearly about her claims. "Tonight we address the federal violations that threaten our community," Margaret declared as a projector threw a blue-white ledger onto the back wall, names, lot numbers, and balances due arranged in crisp columns. Her hired agents flanked the screen like stage ushers, earpieces gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A printed banner for the so-called Federal Housing Compliance Division hung above the display, its borrowed fonts doing just enough to fool anyone who'd never seen real federal type. The production value was impressive, and probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Margaret had invested serious money into this fraud, suggesting she'd been planning this neighborhood-wide extortion for weeks or months. The banner, the fake credentials, the rented vehicles, the hired actors. She'd created an entire theatrical production designed to terrorize suburban families into handing over their savings to avoid imaginary federal consequences. "Multiple properties in this neighborhood have been flagged for immediate compliance action," Agent Thompson intoned, tapping a tablet that advanced the ledger line by line. "Property seizures will begin Monday unless all outstanding violations are resolved immediately." Each swipe magnified another household's total, due the threat landing harder than any stack of papers ever could. Margaret smiled as panic rippled through the crowd like a physical wave. Elderly neighbors clutched purses tighter. Young families whispered frantically about moving costs they couldn't afford. Single mothers calculated impossible budgets for fines they couldn't pay. Margaret was feeding on their terror, like a vampire drawing energy and satisfaction from the fear she'd created through elaborate lies and threats. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, control, and the intoxicating rush of holding people's lives in her hands. She had discovered that fake federal authority was more addictive than any drug, giving her godlike power over her neighbor's financial security and peace of mind. Mrs. Carter stood up, voice shaking with the terror of someone facing financial ruin. "How much do we owe?" The question Margaret had been waiting for, the moment when terror transformed into profit. "Compliance assessments vary by property," Agent Thompson replied, consulting his fake documentation with the solemnity of someone delivering cancer diagnoses. "The Chen residence owes $4,300 for vegetation violations and mailbox non-compliance. The Smith family owes $6,200 for fence infractions and driveway positioning violations." He continued reading amounts that would devastate most families' budgets, numbers carefully calculated to be painful but not impossible. Margaret had researched each family's financial situation, determining exactly how much each household could potentially pay without triggering bankruptcy that might lead to investigations. The Johnsons $3,800, the Pattersons $5,400, the Hendersons $7,200. Each amount represented months of savings, college funds, retirement money that families had worked years to accumulate. I stood up, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. This was the moment that would either save my neighbors or destroy my career, but I couldn't watch innocent families be terrorized into financial ruin by an elaborate fraud. The room felt like a powder keg about to explode, tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every face turned toward me with expressions ranging from hope to blame to desperate pleading. "Agent Thompson, I need to see your federal credentials," I said, voice carrying the authority I'd developed through years of cross-examining hostile witnesses in federal court. The room went silent except for the hum of overhead lights and the sound of people holding their breath. Margaret's smile turned predatory, like a hunter who'd just watched prey walk into a carefully prepared trap. "Mr. Mitchell, you've been obstructing federal housing compliance for days. Your resistance is why this enforcement action became necessary." She was setting me up as the villain who'd brought federal wrath down on innocent families, the troublemaker whose refusal to pay had escalated a simple compliance issue into a community-wide crisis. Several neighbors nodded agreement, clearly viewing me as the source of their problems, rather than another victim of Margaret's elaborate fraud. Margaret had successfully weaponized their fear against me, turning neighbors into allies in her campaign of psychological terrorism. "Because I'm David Mitchell, Senior Federal Prosecutor, United States Attorney's Office, Western District," I announced, voice cutting through the silence like a sword through silk. The words hit the room like a concussion grenade. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People's faces went through rapid cycles of confusion, realization, and shock. Margaret's face drained of color so fast I thought she might faint on the spot. Agent Thompson took an unconscious step backward, like I'd just pulled out a weapon. "And everything you've said tonight constitutes federal fraud, impersonation of federal officers, and organized extortion." I continued, pulling out my actual federal credentials and letting everyone see the real badge, the real identification, the real authority that Margaret had been faking for years. The leather case felt solid and reassuring in my hands, a tangible reminder of actual federal power versus Margaret's theatrical performance. No federal agency called the Housing Compliance Division exists. These credentials are fake, these documents are fake, and these fines are completely fraudulent. Margaret's recovery attempt was pathetic but predictable, the desperate flailing of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. "He's lying. Mental health issues, check his medications." She was grasping at straws that had already been blown away by the hurricane of reality. "This man has been harassing me for days. He's abusing his federal position for personal revenge." Some neighbors looked confused, uncertain who to believe, minds struggling to process the complete reversal of everything they'd been told. But I'd prepared for this moment, knowing Margaret would try to discredit me once her fraud was exposed. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of Margaret's fake federal inspection. Her voice clear as crystal, describing her extortion schemes, in other neighborhoods confessing to crimes that would send her to federal prison for decades. "These are not federal agents," I announced as Agent Thompson began edging toward the exit like a rat abandoning a sinking ship. Margaret made one last desperate play, lunging for my phone like a drowning person grabbing for a life preserver, screaming about evidence tampering and federal conspiracies and government cover-ups. But it was over. Her fake authority had collapsed the moment real authority entered the room. The elaborate performance that had terrorized families for years crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane, leaving only a middle-aged woman facing federal charges that would destroy the rest of her life. The community center erupted in a chaos of voices, as neighbors who'd been terrified moments before now turned on Margaret with fury that years of suppressed fear and frustration had been building toward. "You stole my savings. You threatened my children. You destroyed my garden." Margaret's fake federal agents melted away like fog in sunlight, leaving her alone to face the consequences of years of systematic abuse and psychological terrorism. I called real law enforcement while Margaret sat in a folding chair, crying and mumbling about property values and community standards, her empire of fraud crumbling around her like civilization collapsing in fast forward. The woman who had terrorized neighborhoods with threats of federal action was about to experience actual federal justice, and the irony was so perfect it almost made up for the years of suffering she'd inflicted on innocent families. The FBI arrived Tuesday morning with the kind of methodical precision that makes real federal investigations so terrifying, rolling up to our quiet suburban street in unmarked vehicles that somehow looked more official than Margaret's theatrical black SUVs had ever managed. Unlike Margaret's costumed actors with their obvious props and rehearsed lines, these were quiet professionals who didn't need costumes or theatrical performances to project authority. Special Agent Williams introduced herself with the understated competence that comes from decades of unraveling complex fraud schemes, her credentials real enough to end careers and lives. "Mr. Mitchell, your complaint triggered a federal investigation that's much larger than we initially expected," Agent Williams explained, as crime scene technicians began photographing evidence throughout my house, with the systematic thoroughness that turns homes into legal documents. "Margaret Whitfield's operation extends far beyond this neighborhood. We're looking at organized fraud across multiple counties, involving dozens of co-conspirators and hundreds of victims." She gestured toward the growing convoy of official vehicles filling our normally quiet street like an occupying army. "Because Margaret used claims of federal authority, we're required to investigate every action she took," Agent Williams continued while federal forensic accountants began examining financial records that would determine the scope of Margaret's criminal enterprise. "Every inspection, every fine, every threat made under color of federal law becomes federal evidence requiring verification and documentation." The scope was staggering and bureaucratically inevitable. Every neighbor Margaret had targeted, every document she'd created, every dollar she'd collected, now required federal verification through processes that could take months or years to complete. Within hours, the neighborhood shifted from rumor mill to case file. Teams moved house to house, not to replay Margaret's theater, but to convert it into admissible facts, chain of custody logs, verified timelines, and authentic statute sites where her fakes had been. What mattered wasn't the number of photos taken, it was the audit trail that would survive a federal courtroom. The real nightmare began when Agent Williams explained the bureaucratic cascade that Margaret's fraud had triggered throughout multiple federal agencies that now had jurisdiction over our neighborhood. Every property she inspected is now flagged in federal housing databases pending investigation completion, she said with the clinical detachment of someone delivering terminal cancer diagnoses. Mrs. Carter started crying when she learned her house sale would be frozen until FBI forensic accountants verified no actual federal violations existed. The Smith family's refinancing application was automatically rejected when federal flags appeared on their property records, destroying months of paperwork and threatening their ability to send their daughter to college. Margaret's fake compliance issues had created real federal complications that would take months or years to resolve through bureaucratic processes that treated every claim as potentially legitimate until proven otherwise. The fraud had become reality through pure administrative momentum that nobody could stop. Insurance companies panicked when federal investigation notices appeared on multiple properties, simultaneously triggering automatic policy reviews that treated every claim as suspicious until proven otherwise. "Your homeowner's policies are suspended, pending federal review," became the dreaded phone call every neighbor received within hours of the FBI's arrival. Property values crashed overnight when real estate databases flagged the entire neighborhood as under federal housing investigation, with warnings that could prevent sales for years. Margaret's imaginary federal violations had spawned actual federal consequences that threatened everyone's financial stability through bureaucratic processes designed to protect the government from fraud liability. The irony was suffocating her. Fake federal authority had triggered real federal oversight that was far more destructive than anything she'd ever threatened to do to individual families. FBI search warrants revealed the true scope of Margaret's operation when federal agents discovered her house contained files on over 200 families across 12 different neighborhoods, organized with the precision of a professional intelligence operation. Financial records showed she'd collected more than $300,000 over 3 years through systematic extortion that operated like a criminal corporation. Bank deposits matched her fake compliance fines with mathematical precision that made her guilt undeniable. She'd kept meticulous records of her crimes, apparently believing her county connections made her untouchable by law enforcement. Margaret hadn't just been stealing money from individual families. She'd been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that involved fake credentials, hired actors, rented vehicles, and elaborate documentation designed to defraud victims across multiple counties. The federal investigation revealed a network of accomplices that included county officials, document forgers, and professional con artists. The political corruption investigation exploded when Margaret's brother, County Commissioner Robert Whitfield, was arrested trying to shred documents in his office while federal agents simultaneously raided county buildings throughout the region. Federal search warrants revealed years of complaints about Margaret's activities being buried or ignored in exchange for cash payments that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Commissioner Whitfield had been taking bribes to suppress investigations, while his sister terrorized suburban families with fake federal authority backed by real political protection. Local news couldn't get enough of the story that combined suburban fraud with political corruption in ways that seemed too elaborate for fiction. Federal prosecutor exposes suburban fraud ring connected to county corruption dominated headlines for weeks as federal investigations revealed the scope of Margaret's criminal network. Television reporters described our neighborhood like a crime scene from a Hollywood movie, complete with federal agents' seized documents and political scandals that reached into county government. By Friday, our quiet neighborhood looked like a federal crime scene from a television show, with news trucks lining the streets while reporters interviewed traumatized neighbors about years of systematic abuse they'd been too terrified to report. FBI agents worked methodically through each house, documenting Margaret's violations and separating real housing issues from her fabricated violations with forensic precision that turned our homes into evidence in federal criminal cases. Federal forensic accountants traced every dollar Margaret had stolen while building criminal cases against her extensive network of fake enforcement officers, corrupt county officials, and professional con artists who'd operated across multiple states. The investigation revealed that Margaret's scheme had inspired copycat fraudsters throughout the region, who used her techniques to extort suburban families with fake government authority backed by political corruption. The most bitter irony was watching Margaret's fake federal authority trigger real federal consequences that destroyed innocent families' lives through bureaucratic processes that treated every claim as potentially legitimate until proven otherwise. Her imaginary housing violations had created actual federal red flags that insurance companies and banks took seriously, preventing home sales and refinancing applications throughout multiple neighborhoods. She had achieved through fraud what she'd always threatened, through fake authority federal involvement that affected every property owner in multiple communities, turning her criminal enterprise into a bureaucratic nightmare that would take years to resolve. Margaret's federal court appearance was standing room only, packed with victims from 12 different neighborhoods who'd driven hours to watch her face justice, in a courtroom that felt more like a theater where years of suburban terrorism would finally be judged by actual federal authority. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case that filled multiple tables with evidence: wire fraud for electronic communications, mail fraud for postal threats, conspiracy for her criminal network, and the crown jewel: impersonating federal officers, which carried up to 3 years per incident. Margaret had committed that crime hundreds of times, facing decades in federal prison. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity and mathematical precision. Margaret Whitfield operated a criminal enterprise that stole over $300,000 from suburban families by impersonating federal agents and creating fake housing violations, the prosecutor announced while gesturing toward evidence that filled an entire wall of the courtroom. She terrorized innocent families, corrupted local government officials, and created a network of fraud that extended across multiple counties and affected hundreds of victims. Evidence filled multiple tables, like an exhibition of suburban terrorism, fake badges that looked official but contained subtle errors that revealed their fraudulent nature, fake documents with letterheads that mimicked government agencies, recordings of Margaret describing her extortion schemes with the casual cruelty of someone discussing pest control bank records, showing systematic theft that operated like a criminal corporation. Margaret's defense attorney looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth, tasked with defending the indefensible. Margaret's attempt to paint herself as the victim was pathetic and insulting to everyone who had suffered under her years of systematic abuse. "I was trying to maintain property values," she testified, dabbing at crocodile tears, with tissues that couldn't hide the cold calculation in her eyes. Single woman trying to help her community against aggressive federal prosecutor who abused his position. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Recording after recording of Margaret threatening families, describing her extortion techniques with professional pride, bragging about her county connections that made her untouchable. Her own words condemned her more effectively than any prosecutor could have managed, played back in her own voice describing crimes that shocked even experienced federal investigators. The Smith family paid immediately once we mentioned immigration concerns. The elderly Pattersons handed over their Social Security money when we threatened federal environmental penalties for their bird feeder. Margaret had documented her own crimes with the thoroughness of someone who believed she was building a business rather than destroying lives. The victim impact statements broke hearts throughout the courtroom as family after family described years of terror, financial devastation, and psychological trauma that Margaret's fraud had inflicted on innocent people who'd trusted her fake authority. Mrs. Carter described losing her life savings to Margaret's fake fines, money she'd spent decades accumulating for retirement, that disappeared into Margaret's criminal operation. Jessica, the single mother, testified about Margaret's threats to call child services unless she paid soundproofing fees for her children playing in their own backyard. Elderly Mr. Peterson explained how Margaret's fake federal threats triggered a heart attack that required emergency surgery, nearly killing him over imaginary violations that existed only in Margaret's criminal imagination. Family after family described the psychological torture of living under constant threat from someone they'd trusted as a community leader, someone who'd weaponized their natural respect for authority to terrorize them into financial submission. Commissioner Whitfield's testimony sealed Margaret's fate when he described their criminal partnership in exchange for a reduced sentence that would still send him to federal prison for accepting bribes and obstructing justice. Margaret would identify targets, create fake violations, and I would make sure any complaints disappeared through official channels, he admitted under oath, while Margaret's face turned purple with rage and betrayal. We split the money 60-40 with her keeping the larger share because she took the physical risk of impersonating federal agents. Margaret had destroyed lives for pocket change, terrorizing vulnerable people who trusted her fake authority while enriching herself through systematic fraud that operated like a criminal corporation. Her own brother described their money laundering operation with the clinical detachment of someone confessing to war crimes, explaining how they'd hidden stolen money through fake consulting fees and fraudulent contracts that made their crimes look like legitimate business transactions. The federal judge showed no mercy during sentencing, delivering justice with the measured authority of someone who'd seen every type of criminal fraud imaginable, but was still shocked by Margaret's systematic cruelty. "Mrs. Whitfield, you operated a criminal enterprise that terrorized innocent families for years. You impersonated federal agents, committed systematic extortion, corrupted local government officials, and showed no remorse while blaming your victims for your crimes. 5 years in federal prison, plus $300,000 in restitution that would bankrupt her completely. Margaret would serve every day without possibility of parole. Federal sentences don't allow early release for good behavior. She was led away in handcuffs while victims applauded with the satisfaction of people who'd finally seen justice delivered after years of helpless terror. The woman who'd terrorized neighborhoods with fake federal authority was now experiencing real federal justice that would define the rest of her life. The media coverage was relentless and humiliating, turning Margaret into a national symbol of suburban fraud and abuse of authority. Suburban Karen sentenced to federal prison for HOA fraud dominated news cycles for days, with Margaret's perp walk becoming a viral video with millions of views. Her fake authority had been replaced by real powerlessness as federal marshals transported her to a facility 3 states away from everything she'd known. Property values began recovering immediately after her sentencing, as news coverage attracted buyers who appreciated the federal protections that Margaret's crimes had accidentally created. The neighborhood that had been terrorized by fake federal authority was now protected by real federal oversight that prevented similar schemes from ever taking root again. The ripple effects continued expanding as federal investigations exposed similar schemes in other states where Margaret's operation had inspired copycat fraudsters who used her techniques to extort suburban families nationwide. My case became a federal training example for identifying organized suburban fraud with law enforcement agencies across the country, learning to recognize the warning signs of fake HOA authority schemes. Margaret's criminal innovation had accidentally created a new category of federal prosecution that protected millions of homeowners from similar predators. 2 years later, the Margaret Whitfield case had transformed suburban fraud prosecution nationwide in ways that none of us could have predicted when this nightmare began with her trespassing in my kitchen to photograph my refrigerator. The Federal Trade Commission created new guidelines specifically addressing fake HOA authority schemes, using Margaret's operation as a textbook example of how organized fraud could terrorize entire communities while hiding behind the veneer of legitimate government authority. The Department of Justice established a suburban fraud task force that I was promoted to lead, giving me national responsibility for investigating and prosecuting crimes that had been largely ignored before Margaret's case exposed their devastating impact on American families. Margaret's crimes had accidentally created federal protections that shielded millions of homeowners from similar predators, turning her criminal enterprise into an inadvertent public service that she would have hated knowing about. Margaret's personal destruction was complete and irreversible in ways that satisfied every neighbor who'd suffered under her years of systematic abuse. Federal prison had aged her decades and months, transforming the confident predator who'd terrorized suburban families into a broken woman serving time alongside violent criminals who had no patience for white-collar fraudsters. Her house was foreclosed to pay restitution to victims sold at auction for less than half its previous value. County Commissioner Whitfield lost his pension and faced his own federal charges that would send him to prison for accepting bribes and obstructing justice over many years. Their criminal partnership had cost both siblings everything: money, reputation, freedom, family relationships, and any hope of rebuilding their lives after federal conviction. Margaret's desperate need for control had resulted in complete powerlessness under federal supervision that would continue for years after her eventual release. The neighborhood transformation was remarkable and healing in ways that surprised everyone who'd suffered under Margaret's reign of terror. A legitimate HOA was established with federal oversight, transparent finances, and actual legal authority that protected homeowners rather than exploiting them. Property values recovered and exceeded pre-Margaret levels as news coverage attracted buyers who appreciated the federal protections that had emerged from our community's nightmare. Mrs. Carter's house finally sold for above asking price to a young family who'd read about our federal protections in news articles. The Smith family's refinancing went through without complications, allowing them to send their daughter to college as planned. Jessica's children played freely in their yard, without fear of fake noise violations or threats about child services. The terror that had defined our neighborhood for years was replaced by security that came from actual legal protections rather than fake authority. Federal legislation known as the Margaret Whitfield Act required background checks for all HOA leadership positions and created criminal penalties for fake authority claims that carried sentences severe enough to deter potential fraudsters. State laws established clear procedures for legitimate housing inspections and prohibited private parties from claiming government authority under penalty of federal prosecution. Local police received federal training to recognize suburban fraud schemes before they could destroy families' lives. Margaret's crimes had accidentally created the strongest homeowner protections in American history, with federal oversight preventing the type of systematic abuse she'd perfected over years of criminal operation. The irony would have infuriated her. Her criminal enterprise had generated legal protections that made suburban fraud virtually impossible, while creating federal penalties that destroyed anyone who attempted similar schemes. My career flourished in ways I'd never expected when I moved to this quiet neighborhood, seeking anonymity and recovery from job-related stress. Leading the federal suburban fraud task force gave me purpose beyond traditional prosecution, allowing me to prevent dozens of Margaret-style operations before they could victimize families. Training law enforcement agencies to recognize fake authority schemes became my specialty, with Margaret's case serving as the perfect example of how organized fraud could hide behind suburban respectability. The community celebrations were touching, and frequent marking anniversaries of Margaret's arrest, conviction, and sentencing with neighborhood gatherings that celebrated justice and recovery. New families moving in were educated about their federal protections and legal rights through workshops held in the same community center where Margaret had once terrorized neighbors with fake federal authority. Her theater of intimidation had been transformed into education that empowered residents against future fraud. Margaret's old house stood as a monument to the dangers of unchecked suburban authority and the importance of questioning claims that seemed too official to challenge. New owners renovated it completely, erasing every trace of Margaret's presence and replacing her criminal legacy with family life that represented everything she'd tried to destroy. Children played on lawns that Margaret had once claimed violated federal regulations. Mailboxes stood at heights Margaret had deemed criminal. Gardens bloomed with plants Margaret had called non-compliant. Her fictional federal violations had been replaced by real federal protections that made our community stronger than ever before, with oversight that prevented anyone from repeating her systematic abuse of authority. The neighborhood that had been terrorized by fake government power was now protected by real government power that served families rather than exploiting them. When Margaret entered my house for that fake inspection, she thought she was targeting another helpless homeowner who would pay rather than fight back against her elaborate fraud. She didn't know she was trespassing against a federal prosecutor who specialized in exactly her type of organized crime. Her desperate need for control triggered federal investigations that protected our entire community and created national precedents that shield millions of American families from similar predators. Sometimes defending your own house means bringing down their entire house of lies, exposing criminal enterprises that masquerade as legitimate authority, while terrorizing innocent people who trust in the basic decency of their neighbors. Margaret's fake federal authority had been replaced by real federal justice that would define the rest of her life, while the neighborhoods she terrorized now thrived under federal protections that her crimes had accidentally created. The woman who had tried to control everyone's lives through fear now spends her days in a federal facility powerless and forgotten, while the communities she destroyed have rebuilt themselves stronger than ever before.